Well, Kay set me up pretty well by teaching the children that today is Trinity Sunday. And it's not something that Jesus taught, but it's something that the church in its orderly fashion excuse me, has come after Pentecost, which we celebrated last week. And so Trinity Sunday celebrates God as we now know God. God as Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Or we might say, God as our Creator, who brought all things into being. The Redeemer, who came to be with us in the person of Jesus so that we might know God. And the Sustainer, the Spirit, or breath of God, who breathes in us and through us. So that's a little brief theology lesson for this morning, because it would be easy to get bogged down in some really tough details. And so on to our scriptures. In Proverbs, we are introduced to someone, or someone who is thought of as an aspect of God that we don't often think of. Lady Wisdom. And whenever I read this text of this woman calling out, I always picture a very tall woman with striking looks, and she's standing in Times Square. And she's surrounded by the neon lights and all those signs and ads of our consumer culture. And there her voice cries out amid the retail messages that tell us our lives will be better if we only look a little bit younger, if we only smell better, if we only make more money and drive nicer cars and have bigger homes. But that is not the wisdom that was there at creation. That wisdom tells us something very different, and I think much more simple. The wisdom of God, the wisdom of creation, is simply a way of living, talking and thinking, a way that honors God and also blesses other people. Genuinely wise people understand and do what God created us to do. Now, we often think of wisdom as something that we humans learn or create. Think of all the research going on, or all those universities out there teaching people. Now, all these things definitely contribute to the well-being of our society, but from God's perspective, from the biblical perspective, true wisdom is created as a kind of being. It's a way of being that is a gracious gift from God. And the message in Romans speaks to us today, even as it did to the Romans when Paul wrote to them. He proclaims that we are a people of faith, and that God draws us close. And so, though we have to live in this world, no matter what befalls us or challenges might come, we have to live in this world. So how are we supposed to have the wisdom of God while being only human? Well, I think in simple terms, living in this world and being only human but creatures of God means that we just have to listen to that alternative voice, that wisdom is still out there in the midst of all the world puts up in front of us to tempt us. She calls out to us, but it means that we have to listen really hard, I think. But it means also trusting in the power of the Spirit that Kay was talking about that's right here within us, given to us. The Spirit within us that allows us to stand counter to what popular culture endorses. Think of it this way. Would you want how you live to be what one author calls the American proverb? And that proverb is, different strokes for different folks. Or you might say, live and let live. To each his own. A man's home is his castle. What these all boil down to is a one-word phrase, which I think you'll recognize it. I think it's also as apathetic as one can get. the great postmodern verbal shrug of whatever. Or it's even shorter when you just say, eh. That attitude or philosophy of life says that in the end our lives have no meaning. It doesn't come together in any sort of coherent fashion. But wisdom, the Spirit speaking within us, means if we turn within and if we rely on and steep ourselves in the words of God, we can find that life adds up to something very coherent, that life adds up to something good, stable, and full of shalom. Because there is a Creator God who made each person, made you and you and you and me. God made each of us and each thing. Proverbs tells us that, or shows us, that wisdom delights in human beings. And so God delights in us. And so, in a like manner, if we are living into the Spirit of God, we are also to find joy in others. Not to try and seek and control them or expect them to be just like us, but truly to delight in the other as another. And that is wisdom. And then I think a very important part is that wisdom was there at creation. And in God's creation, there was a playfulness. Think of all the creatures that God has created. And wisdom shows a playful delight in all of God's creatures. Instead of dismissing the humble hippopotamus or disdaining the odd platypus, wisdom looks on in joy at seeing something new, something different, because it comes from God. If we can have just an inkling of that sense of looking at the world in delight and seeing something new, that is the Spirit's wisdom. And when we are able to look at the world in that way, we are able to change the world, even in just our own little space. It means that we work in certain ways and not in others. And if everyone lives in such a way, we would all be interconnected, recognize our interconnection. And it would be a marvelously complex system of mutual affirmation. I think the challenge to us is to remember to delight in life, in those things that are familiar and in those things that are different. And when we begin to see others as delightful and wonderful and someone we should know, our world will begin to change. And I think when we take those steps, it might be just a little bit like playing with fire. You never know what will happen.